Midpoint is a monthly webinar series, and we intend to bring up interesting political perspective to the South African public and beyond. Today we are presenting a new publication edited by Heather Thuynsma from the University of Pretoria. The idea for this publication on brittle democracies in Anglophone Africa came up when I had a chat with Heather on the decolonization in South Africa. And we were asking ourselves what the term actually meant and where does decolonization start and where it should end.
Democracy is a key topic of debate, especially given the elections held in the past few months across the world, but specifically across the continent, in Uganda most recently, Tanzania, and also Ghana. These events have caused some political parties and civil society organizations to question, among other things, the integrity of the election process, whether it truly facilitated public participation and fact-based debate. There are also many who bemoan the lack of transparency, accountability, and the robustness of institutions such as the courts, the independent electoral management bodies, and access to and for a nonpartisan press. In essence, democracy needs to be tailored to the context in which it operates. This brittleness has been blamed on a shared colonial legacy, whose lasting effect has served to undermine power structures and has, in some cases, encouraged dominant political parties, many of whom played key roles in the liberation struggle. Essentially, democracy's promise is to deliver peace and prosperity. And prosperity in an economic sense is something that is key and that leaders will have to seriously address.
We are focusing on Africa, but we should not forget the history of democracy, how democracy evolved. Democracy was not given, democracy was fought for. And therefore, we should expect that the African countries are likely to start fighting, should ensure that the citizens fight for the democratic rights, democratic institutions, and so on. For democracy to succeed, it must be pushed from within and not from without. And two things or two institutions or two groups are seen as those who are likely to push for democracy to succeed in Africa. One is civil society, and everybody talks of civil society, and the other one is the youth. But I think what we should be campaigning for is for the political parties, especially the current political parties, to push for more youth into parliament, to ensure that a number of youths move forward to become ministers, deputy ministers, and so on.
What happens when we not just disavow, but actually challenge from the ground up notions of democracy, not only through this idea of shared global values, but a kind of shared African values. And what are those values, right? Those become the questions. That the question of external influence does tie back into these issues that have been raised around the continuation between the colonial enterprise and the post-colonial enterprise and how African countries deal with that question. And if we take the American context, should we then actually even be paying attention to the Western countries because they seem to also be failing or also forming brittle democracies? So is this brittleness only tied to Africa, or is this a brittleness about the democratic principle in its whole?
Democracy should not be a one-size-fits-all. It should definitely not be something that resembles a Western democracy, which, as we have seen in the past several months, has gone through its own trials and challenges.
The reason why we focused on Anglophone Africa is because they had all this more or less the same or a similar starting point. We also should talk here a little bit about the exceptionalism of South Africa. And I think it would be maybe interesting to have a closer look on other African countries to think like, okay, what can we change maybe here in the political system to make it more inclusive, to make it more African? Because in the end, democracy, and that's what I'm deeply convinced, it's only working if it comes from the people themselves. Many people here in the chat room said the same thing.
We should not take it for granted that change of leadership or change of parties from one party to another as democratic consolidation, because it can mean something else. It's not the change between one political party and another political party that marks democracy.
does the fact that South Africa wrote its own constitution speak to, the reality that young people today are expressing, which is that actually the constitution does not grant them economic freedom that still remains, in their view, in the hands of the white minority. So what do we do with that? How do we strike a balance between the so-called perceived notions of Western democracy coming from elsewhere and the views that the people themselves from the ground are saying, this is what we want?